Hello, and welcome to tonight's Baumer conversation. I'm Ashley Bigham, Assistant Professor of Architecture at the Knowlton School. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Anna Bokov. Anna is a faculty member at the Cooper Union and City College in New York. She is a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture at the ETH Zurich and is a former member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Anna has taught at Parsons, Cornell University, Yale School of Architecture, Northeastern University, and Harvard Graduate School of Design. She has also worked as an architect and urban designer at OMA, NBBJ, and Ennead. She also served as an editor on Project Russia and Project International magazines. Anna's recent book, Avant-Garde as Method, Vkhutemas, and the Pedagogy of Space, 1920 to 1930, was published last year in 2020 by Park Books and is dedicated to the Russian counterpart of the Bauhaus. The book is a comprehensive and provocative look inside this important pedagogical experiment from Moscow in the 1920s. Anna's book explores the ideals, values, and resultant work from this unique pedagogical model. In addition to its stunning collection of images and archival materials, I think this book is an invaluable contribution to the study of architectural education, to our understanding of architecture of the Russian avant-garde, and also is an important resource for educators who want to move beyond a Western European focus in architectural history. I'm thrilled that Anna will continue the presentation of this research, also as an exhibition at the Cooper Union, scheduled to open this spring in 2020, or this coming spring in 2022, which I'm very excited about. Anna is also a recipient of multiple awards, including the Mellon Fellowship, the Beinecke Research Grant, and the Graham Foundation Grant. Her scholarly work has been published by the Journal of Architecture, Perspecta, the Walker Art Center Primer, MoMA Post, Venice Biennale, Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, and many others. She holds a PhD from Yale University, a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design, and a Bachelor of Architecture from Syracuse University. And before I turn it over to Anna, I want to remind our audience joining with us tonight live on YouTube that you can actually ask questions during the lecture or at the end of the lecture by putting those questions or comments in the YouTube chat box, and I will read those out at the end of Anna's presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you tonight.
Thank you, Ashley, very much for this generous introduction and for this opportunity. It's wonderful to see you. I wish I could be there in person. I absolutely love the building. I think it's one of the most remarkable schools of architecture in the world, Knowlton. So at some point, I hope I have a chance to visit again. So I would like to share my screen now. Do that. Thank you. So my lecture today is called Space Not Stone, Architecture Pedagogy at Vkhutemas, 1920-1930. In 1925, artist and architect El Lisitsky, shown here photographed by his Bauhaus colleague Joseph Albers, posed a rhetorical question. Is there modern architecture in Russia? It does not exist, he argued. There is only a pursuit of modern architecture, just like everywhere now. There is no new architectonic culture anywhere. However, have patience, pleaded the author of the famous constructor photo montage, and I quote, "We're just in the middle of the job and are happy to be accomplishing it specifically for the present." The job had already been started a few years earlier, as Lisitsky writes, by a group of young professors, some of whom we can see here, Nikolai Ladovsky and Vladimir Krinsky in circles, who, according to Lisitsky, and I quote, succeeded in creating an autonomous architecture department at the Vkhutemas Academy in Moscow, where they had the benefit of the scientific apparatus of a modern university and could rely on gifted young students. So something new started to happen. Something new started to happen, in fact, much earlier, when the futurist artists of the emerging avant-garde movement embraced the revolutionary events in Russia, literally turning streets into brushes and squares into canvas, to quote the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. Despite their general contempt for the avant-garde, the Bolshevik leaders had no choice other than embracing it as the only viable antithesis to the traditional Tsarist aesthetic, with its historicized styles and academic foundations. From the first socialist reforms of 1918 and until the end of the first five-year plan in 1932, the artistic avant-garde in Russia, led by figures such as Lisitsky, benefited from unparalleled support of the state. Its protagonists enjoyed an unprecedented agency in visualizing the communist future and constructing the new mass society, becoming de facto partners in the grandiose Soviet enterprise. The historical significance of this moment is that in the Soviet context, cultural and social programs were integrated with the spatial ones, and not just in any way, but on a national scale. And architecture became a critical instrument for the major infrastructural reconfiguration of the built environment. In other words, the entire country and society at large became an object of design. And the ambition, of course, didn't just stop there, with the idea of world revolution haunting long after 1917. One of the first steps in realizing this transformative agenda was a radical educational reform ratified in 1918, which restructured the entire higher educational system, abolishing all existing institutions, including Imperial Academy of the Arts and applied art schools. In this particular case, I'm showing the case of Moscow. In its place, the state set up a new national network of the so-called Free State Art Studios, known as SVOMAS, an acronym. 2 years later, in 1920, these three state studios, or SVOMAS, were unified under a single umbrella called Art and Technical Studios, or known as an acronym Vkhutemas, which combined art and production disciplines. This included, and I'll read them, architecture, painting, sculpture, the art ones, and then graphics or printing, textiles, ceramics, wood, and metalworking faculties. In 1927, Vkhutemas underwent another major reform and was renamed into the Institute, or known as Vkhutim. I'm just using the name Vkhutemas here for the entire organization. The school was eventually disbanded in 1930 and restructured into several profile institutions, including the Moscow Architecture and Construction Institute, where some of the protagonists continued to work. Vkhutemas' shutdown was part of a larger shift from the avant-garde to socialist realism, signaled by the competition of the Palace of Soviets that you can see here. And the school's legacy was proclaimed formalist, which was a derogatory term under the Stalinist regime. Its archives were sequestered and its memory basically erased for decades to come. Vkhutemas, as a central institution of the avant-garde movement, became the subject of my book, Avant-Garde as Method, that Ashley mentioned. The school offered free education and accepted students from underprivileged backgrounds, regardless of their artistic talent or academic standing, often even without secondary education. For the first time in history, it accepted women to the Institute of Higher Art Education. Women could join any of the 8 departments, including architecture. From the very beginning, Vkhutemas was positioned to fulfill an ambitious political mandate to educate the working class masses, and was charged with preparing specialists for the modern industry, something that distinguished it from its contemporary, the German Bauhaus, which initially aimed to train artist craftsmen. What further distinguished the two schools, according to the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Alfred Barr, who visited Vkhutemas a number of times during his trip to Russia in 1927, was the fact that while the Bauhaus aimed to develop an individual, the Moscow workshops focused on developing the masses. Open to everyone according to their abilities, I quote, and aimed at forming a so-called working community, the two schools differed significantly on the matter of their community's size. With an enrollment that reached nearly 2,000 students, Vkhutemas was over 10 times, and even more, larger than its German counterpart. It was a massive modern undertaking. While there were many parallels in the early history of the two institutions, there were, of course, plenty of differences. The two schools shared not only their founding principles, but many key ideas on modern design education. Both Bauhaus and Vkhutemas were founded in place of fine art college and a craft school, creating a synthetic educational model. Even the buildings that the schools initially occupied are somewhat similar, built at the turn of last century by their respective predecessors. Both Bauhaus and Vkhutemas offered instruction in all disciplines of practical art, mastering skills in industrial design and production. Beyond the difference in student enrollment, there were some significant ones in the curricular structure of the school, of each of the schools. So on the left is the famous diagram devised by the founding director of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, and on the right is a diagram that I made much later reflecting the structure of Vkhutemas around the same time. Both schools were interdisciplinary, with overall training including many of the same areas, such as glass, clay, ceramics, stone sculpture, wood and metalworking, weaving or textiles, and color or painting. The culmination of Vkhutemas studies resulted in a diploma project at the work diagram, reflecting each of the areas of study. So students produced individual works based on their respective specializations, whether it be textiles or architecture. At the Bauhaus, by contrast, all the disciplines, sculpture, painting, and crafts were regarded as, and I quote, inseparable components of new architecture that came together in a, and I quote, unified work of art, the great structure at the core of the diagram. Originally envisioned as a crystal symbol of new faith in a woodcut by Lionel Feininger, the act of building was manifest in several structures throughout the Bauhaus existence, both imaginary and built, conceived and realized collaboratively by teachers and students, such as the Sommerfeld House or Haus am Horn. It culminated as a landmark of functionalist architecture, the new Bauhaus building in Dessau, designed and built by Gropius in 1926. The actual program, architecture program, was not set up until the late 1927 with the arrival of the new Bauhaus director, Johannes Meyer. At Vkhutemas, architecture department existed, of course, from the very beginning, from the start. And by 1927, the best works of several of its architecture studios were featured in this booklet that you can see with the cover designed by El Lisitsky. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the booklet and of the Vkhutemas architecture curriculum was its foundational program, known as the Space Course, which was conceived by a group of rationalist architects led by Ladovsky, who we just met. This program included a sequence of exercises on form and structure, on mass and weight, on vertical and horizontal rhythm, on mass and balance, and structure, etc. The student innovative, in fact, for its time, that it was featured in one of the first books on modern architecture, the seminal text by Adolf Benny, Modern Functional Building, published also in 1926. Vkhutemas student projects, in fact, were known and disseminated widely at the time. Dozens were featured in El Lisitsky's book, Russia, Reconstruction of Architecture in the Soviet Union. And also, since we started with talking about 1925, the year of Lisitsky's comment on the pursuit of modern architecture, in the catalog for the exhibition of decorative arts in Paris that was held that same year. And of course, many of you know it as the home of the Pavilion de l'Esprit Nouveau, a model home constructed for the exhibition by Le Corbusier just before he did this building behind me. And also, many of you know the Soviet Pavilion, designed by Konstantin Melnikov for the exhibition. Melnikov, in fact, was the Vkhutemas professor and ran the so-called New Academy Studios together with Ilya Golosov from 1920 on. Another Vkhutemas professor, again, also actively participated in the exhibition, Alexander Rodchenko, designed the Workers' Club showroom, another seminal work of modern design. Somewhat less known, perhaps, is the presence of Vkhutemas student work at the exhibition. In fact, the work was massive. The exhibition was massive and received many awards at the time, and was again widely, I think, attended and mentioned in the press. And yet, despite despite the sort of its I think resonance at the time, very little is known about that and about the Vkhutemas students participating in that very, very important event. So, however, the school received a lot of praise, and even Le Corbusier, shown here in Moscow, described it in his journal, and I quote from Jean-Louis Cohen's The Future of Architecture book, as an extraordinary demonstration of the modern credo. Here, a new world is being rebuilt out of a mystique which gives rise to pure technique. So how did this group of young architects manage to succeed in developing the pedagogy of modern architecture that could enjoy that level of international coverage by 1925? The first step in this direction was the experimental work produced at the Commission for the Synthesis of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, a short-lived organization that existed between 1919 and 1920, that was instrumental in bringing together the protagonists of different fields, so painting, sculpture, and architecture, essentially becoming one of the earliest interdisciplinary think tanks. Ladovsky designed a proposal called the architectural phenomena of a communal house. He actually did a number of projects, but this one in particular is interesting because at the bottom of the drawing, he wrote a somewhat cryptic commentary, and I'll read it. Miracles are made by technology. Miracles must be made in architecture. It is in space that the soaring wonders of modernity will be built by art plus the intellect. Space, not stone, is the material of architecture. So this idea of the primacy of space as the material of architecture is something that seems perfectly mundane to us today, must have been completely original in 1920. And thinking of space as an abstract art category enabled Ladovsky to develop an entirely new approach to architectural form. The approach that would allow him and his colleagues to propose and implement a pedagogy for teaching modern architecture before modern architecture was yet a commonly recognized phenomenon. So, how is this done? What did he do first? So in October 1920, Ladovsky announced his first assignment for a foundational course that he called Space at Vkhutemas. Nearly 5 decades later, in 1969, his colleague and fellow educator, Vladimir Krinsky, who was also in the photograph, remembers that moment as being highly charged. He writes, and I quote, "All other studios had confirmed the usual type of assignments in line with long-standing academic tradition. Everyone was very intrigued. What kind of problems would be provoked by us, the left ones?" In a completely silent room, Ladovsky read the assignment. He asked the students to articulate the properties of architectural geometric form, of a box-like rectangular prism that had a certain size and proportion, in this case square in plan and 1.5 squares in elevation. In order to visualize this basic geometric ratio, he proposed to inscribe a circle and a semicircle within the prism, which allowed the viewer to evaluate the parity of each of the sides relative to the diameters of the respective pairs of circles. So for the measure of the articulation of form was about establishing a correlation between its perception in space or in perspective relative to its idealized state registered through representational conventions or plan and elevation. Thus, relative perspectival view should seek to achieve its absolute geometric limit expressed orthogonally. This constituted what Ladovsky called architectural rationality, one of the key principles of his theory initially referred to as formalism and later named by him rationalism. The foundations of this theory, along with the exercises, were outlined in the Journal of the Association of New Architects called Osnova, an organization that Ladovsky founded in 1923. And the journal was called Osnova News, published by Ladovsky together with Lisitsky, also in 1926. So the same year that Lisitsky then joined the Vkhutemas faculty at the woodworking department. So if in 1920 modern architecture, as Lisitsky pointed out, actually did not even exist in 1925, it was still in its nascent state, teaching this subject must have presented an unsurmountable challenge. How does one teach something that has no direct precedent, and in fact, largely unknown, without resorting to the known past, in this case, let's say classical defaults? The challenge of educating the masses, while simultaneously coming up with a new way of thinking about the discipline, required a coherent, well-designed program in which every step, every exercise strategically prepared its participants for the next. In the decade that followed, Ladovsky and his colleagues succeeded in inventing the pedagogy that, to quote one of the major educators of the 20th century, Abraham Flexner, endeavored to advance the frontiers of knowledge. The foundational curriculum they devised at Vkhutemas challenged the established canons of the academic tradition by replacing it with an open-ended inquiry into spatial form. Here you can see that one in a smaller version. The top-down academic instruction was recast into a dynamic educational model, which was explorative in nature and built around a continuous feedback between assignments and solutions, and was based on active dialogue between students and teachers. The resultant abstract studies were then articulated into architectural designs that would have program and site and would be taught within the school's advanced studios. This process that started from abstract studies, like this one on mass and weight by Lydia Komarova, would continue to build towards advanced projects that would be implemented, continually revised throughout the decade of Vkhutemas' existence. The resulting projects were clearly conceived in 3 dimensions. Their plastic forms were not easily captured in orthogonal drawings. This method allowed young architects like Komarova, pictured here, to develop something truly new. She was one of the few lucky ones to have survived to tell the story of Vkhutemas, as she lived pretty much 100 years old. Vkhutemas' propositions not only addressed the present moment, incorporating the technological advances of its time, but far exceeded the boundaries of what was possible. Envisioning the future that we're still now coming to terms with, such as the Space Colony by Georgy Krutikov. So given the size of enrollment at Vkhutemas and its ambitious pedagogical agenda, its faculty were challenged to not only come up with standardized methods of instruction, but also with objective ways of thinking about spatial form, aiming to formulate something that can be thought of as a universal architectural science, or what they called rationalist architecture, ratio architecture. In fact, rationalization of everything, from manual labor practices which were in fact subjected to the so-called scientific organization with motion studies, etc., to industrial production and construction technologies permeated the 1920s. And architecture, of course, was no exception. So architects turned to applied psychology, which by that moment developed a rather sophisticated scientific apparatus for measuring a wide range of human sensations, from attention and memory to sight and, of course, perception, like here in the labs of Hugo Münsterberg and Harvard. So in 1927, Ladovsky and his colleagues actually Georgy Krutikov, established a psychotechnical laboratory at Vkhutemas. The instruments they developed measured the aptitude for various kinds of spatial assessment, which was deemed essential to training future architects. In fact, today we talk a lot about different kinds of intelligence, so this would be spatial intelligence. They ranged from a simple device testing the ability to determine the angle between two lines, and there you can see the archival photo and a model produced by students at the Cooper Union who took my seminar last year, and also did this wonderful video, which I'll show animation, of the angle I meter. So that one measures the ability to determine the angle. So you can see here the test would only see the blind circle and the lines, and then the administrator would be behind and be able to tell the exact numbers. Another instrument is plane eye meter. So here, let me demonstrate that one. That measures the relationship between geometric forms, the kinds of forms, and their respective areas. So one would move this sliding glass to determine the sort of equal areas of the different geometric figures. So the results of the test would then be entered into the so-called talent chart that would allow to record the data received and to track progress of each of the students. The other devices included the volume eye meter, designed to study volume in relation to the geometry of its vessel. So again, the kind of the type of the shape of the geometric volume and the amount of liquid that was in it. And finally, the space eye meter, which you just saw earlier, a device for assessing spatial depth relative to an incline. And this one was intended to test one's ability to translate the visual depth perception into measurable units, and adapted for all sorts of probably tortures later in the 20th century. So Le Corbusier, who we just saw earlier and who worked in Russia in the 1920s, decided to take the test and allegedly failed. But fortunately, the instruments were meant not only to test spatial perception, but also to train it. So the plan is to construct our own functioning laboratory at the Cooper Union by next spring, which would become part of the exhibition on Vkhutemas that Ashley mentioned early next year. So I think I would maybe stop here, if that's okay. And I want to thank you and invite any questions. So maybe stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm going to remind everyone who's watching on YouTube that you can put questions or comments in the chat, and I will relay them to Anna. But I'll start with a question of my own. I'm wondering, in your research and also in your teaching about this topic, Vkhutemas is often referred to as the Russian Bauhaus, or that's a kind of shorthand explanation for it. I wonder if sometimes that is a problematic comparison for you, or do you always find it useful, or do you also kind of see it as, I mean, clearly it was its own standalone school, but that as a useful comparison, I'm wondering what the limits of that are, and if you ever present this material or topic without actually mentioning the Bauhaus, or are the two kind of inextricably linked?
An excellent question. So I find the comparison productive. For sure, and first and foremost because the Bauhaus is infinitely more known and researched and written about and featured than the Vkhutemas. There's not even a kind of a close comparison, meaning today for us as a kind of historical moment where we are. We know so much about the Bauhaus and we know so little about Vkhutemas. And yet at that time, so 100 years ago when the two schools existed, they were, I would say, on par with one another as many contemporaries, and both teachers and students have, I'd say, mentioned or written, or we have a lot of historical evidence of that. And maybe one of the most telling, I would say, moments in terms of this kind of how close the Bauhaus and Vkhutemas were at the time is the fact that the majority of the so-called Bauhauslers went to the Soviet Union. In fact, many were aiming to teach at the Vkhutemas after the closure of the Bauhaus. Of course, then historical situation a political situation in the Soviet Union very quickly became quite, let's say, challenging for them, and many left as quickly as they could. Some stayed, some actually perished in the concentration camp of the Stalinist regime. So, but just in terms of the sheer numbers at that moment in the early 1930s, that's, I think, a very telling fact. So in the beginning, in the sort of moments when the Bauhaus was just being created, there were also a lot of communication. And in fact, there is even evidence of Gropius sort of being very closely affiliated with or being very attentive to the developments in then young Soviet Russia, and looking at the art programs that were devised by Lunacharsky and others, so the head of the Ministry of Education in Russia, and sort of looking at the reforms that were happening there. So the Free State Art Studios, in fact, that I mentioned, were founded in 1918, which is just before Bauhaus, which was founded, of course, as we know, in April 1919. So there is so much, even in terms of the bookends, that connects the two schools. And then, of course, there were also, many visits, correspondence, exhibitions, et cetera, with main protagonists, being very, very intensively, connected to. On both sides, and kind of very carefully looking at what's going on the other at the other school. So, and I'm saying both Vkhutemas teachers looking at what's going on at the Bauhaus, and the other way around. So it's not a comparison that I would say ever would exhaust itself. In fact, I think it is worthwhile. Another publication, that's the one we actually don't have yet, I would argue, about the Bauhaus, because we have literally, I think, probably dozens of books published on the Bauhaus just, the year of its centennial, but that one is still waiting to be produced. So it's next in line there.
So you have your next project lined up, is it?
That one, actually, I think of as an edited volume. So it would be something where I think there needs a lot of contributors, because there's a lot of scholarship here. And yes, I'm hoping that that's something I would work on.
Excellent. So when you were talking about the school being specifically different in that the Moscow school was educating the masses or focused on the masses of people and not the individual in the way the Bauhaus was, I was wondering how that might manifest in all parts of the curriculum, and come not only the size of the school, the fact that they were accepting women into every discipline, they were accepting people from all classes, but also how that might have come into the idea of the projects, the pedagogy, the individual assignments. Maybe you kind of allude to that at the end with these instruments, maybe the instruments as another way to kind of test and teach masses of students. But I'm curious if there are other ways that you think that idea of the masses really came down into the kind of individual, maybe assignments versus assignments that you might have done at the Bauhaus.
Yes. So first of all, this is so that quote is by Barr, which is kind of an interesting one, right? So I don't necessarily agree that Vkhutemas did not at all think about the individual, but certainly the overall message is an idea is mass education and standardized education, and also education that is accessible regardless of, as I said, your sort of level of, let's say, ability or talent, or regardless of your even kind of previous level of education, which is an incredibly empowering and I think very beautiful idea. Something that I think resonates with us today quite a bit, as we, I think all, I would argue, kind of want to, might be interested in engaging in art and design, in a more profound way. So again, there's this design intelligence, right? Or there's a intelligence in terms of recognizing, art in a kind of deeper sense, learning about color, et cetera, et cetera. So all those things that were becoming increasingly kind of part of the scientific and objective knowledge, again, in both schools, Bauhaus and Vkhutemas. So in terms of, I think this is an excellent question about like how is the pedagogy different at the Vkhutemas and the Bauhaus, and it's actually tricky because it's not, there was for sure a very intense collaboration, and we see that even in the Gropius diagram, right, where at the core of the diagrams there is this kind of ultimate work of total design, right? The building that where everybody, the students, the masters, the craftsmen, would work together and would produce this sort of single total work of art. And so in that way, there is, I think, a very strong collaborative approach at the Bauhaus. At the Vkhutemas, it's I would say a bit different in a sense that there is actually a much kind of larger project at stake, right? That is the kind of the whole society, the construction of the new lifestyle on a national scale. And that is very much a part of the Vkhutemas mission, that really we are here to develop a new, an entirely new, let's say, aesthetic. And specifically with architecture, there is actually a very strong collaborative approach, which is in fact is being termed something like a brigade method, where students and teachers would work together, not just on construction sites, but actually on the design itself. And there would often be competitions, for example, that would be among the groups led by both the teachers, but also led by the students entirely, and especially that's happening towards the kind of later years of the decade, the first 5-year plan, the 28-29, when there is an increasingly kind of huge resources being placed on not just designing buildings, but actually building entire new cities. And that's why we're beginning to see those urban projects at Vkhutemas as the diploma projects at the architecture department. So it's architecture is seen as really a collective project. And in fact, to the degree that oftentimes authorship in the way that we understand it today is not thought of in that way at all, that the ideas are actually being developed collectively, for better or worse, I would say for better, and then shared collectively, and then each team would run with whatever the best idea would be. So it's actually a very it's structurally ingrained method at Vkhutemas. And then of course, yes, you're absolutely right. Even in the very beginning, when all the students are working on sort of the same brief, as like groups of hundreds of students.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
I don't know if that answers it, but it's it's a big topic, and it's a different way of I would say different way of working. Where, and the big difference is if we think about the kind of tradition of architectural teaching, let's say in the academy, right, in the Beaux-Arts, where there is a master and there is an atelier, and then there is a kind of an academic tradition that's being passed from generation to generation, where students are actually, having to learn the canon of the order. They have to copy the exact, detail of something, right? Whether it's Pantheon, Parthenon, or Louvre, whatever it might be, and study the orders, et cetera, and that's considered kind of knowledge, right? That's passed. Here we have an entirely kind of a reversal of all of that, where the young generation is being empowered to produce and test and really kind of think in a completely open-ended way. Kind of the sort of the more open-ended, the better, in fact, at a certain period. And it produces incredible results, the kinds that we're still, I'd say kind of are admiring.
So a couple of questions have come in through.
Okay.
I'm going to read out from some of our students. The first is from Sarah Skilling. How do you think Vkhutemas would have evolved if the political climate continued to support it instead of shifting towards a more imperialist approach?
Great question, and of course, history doesn't know that. But if it were to continue, and in fact, there was a moment, I would say, in the early 30s, which is another sort of very, very interesting moment for me as a scholar, is when it wasn't yet quite clear what that new direction of architecture was. And there was actually a lot of polemic in terms of like, okay, so what is this new, socialist architecture? Or what is this new, proletarian sort of language mean? And the one thing that happens is that there is an incredible initiative towards sort of creating a very universal approach, which is really fascinating. So it's not something that is based on classical order, but it's something that actually, and this is what I'm sort of, I've talked a little bit about this idea where it goes from a style to a method, and that's a transition that happens during the decade. But then really is actually, interestingly enough, crystallizes, I would say, actually even in the 30s, where pretty much any style could be addressed by the method that Vkhutemas creates. It's really universal, and I think there is this incredible kind of exploration where architects are trying all those different styles, whether it's bringing in architecture of ancient Egypt or Babylon or Greece, Rome, and then developing the kind of motifs. But all of that is relative to the kind of incredibly sophisticated mass and massing, I would say, language, right? The language of rhythm, the language of all of those abstract elements that they now understand and can work with. And so that is actually a moment of, I would say, incredible freedom and promise that happens in the 30s, and then unfortunately, I would say gets somewhat truncated later on. But I think there is some continuity that, in fact, happens even in the 30s. We just, again, don't maybe know as much about it.
So another question that's come in from Caitlin Lux. She's asking about the position of women at the school, which you referenced a little bit. She said, at the Bauhaus, women were often put in particular roles that might have been seen as lesser, like in the crafts area. She says, was this the same for women at Vkhutemas, or were they peers to their male counterparts as students and educators? And I think you've mentioned already that they were allowed to join any of the disciplines at the beginning of the school. And I would just add on to her question, did that ever change as the school evolved in the 30s, 40s, and transitioned into other forms of education? Did that kind of acceptance of women into architecture and all of the fields, did that remain, or did that change also over the years?
Excellent question. Thank you. I would say that it remained, and even, well, not always. So first of all, it was institutionalized. It was a systemic condition. In other words, that there was, the equal rights and the right to labor was, and in fact, the duty also to work, not just the right, was something that was there from the very beginning in the Soviet sort of system. So part of that was to be able to, not only allowing women to work, but also to increase, in fact, the number of workers. So it actually had a very, I would say, practical kind of side to it. So, but it also was quite progressive, relatively speaking. So, however, of course, it wasn't an easy journey, and it wasn't, even though formally, let's say, it was equal. Of course, it took a long time for women to take leadership positions, obviously, and we all know about that. So actually, interestingly enough, in the profession, women had emerged as sort of practicing architects much before they were emerged, let's say, professors in the Department of Architecture and kind of leadership roles. So there were fields like landscape architecture that were practically non-existent, in the kind of contemporary sense. Before that, already in the 30s, with the graduates from Ladovsky specifically, architecture studio were, in the leadership positions like Lyubov Zaleskaya or Militsa Prokhorova, a number of others. Komarov showed, right, is definitely, a very important example, I would say, of that. So in terms of students, of course, the numbers were, lower, meaning there were fewer women students than male students. They were, from the very beginning, they were women students, and those who also ended up producing incredible projects for their diplomas as well. So you can really, you can see that this sort of training was allowing for everybody to flourish. So that's really just wonderful to see. In terms of, what else can I say? Well, in the departments such as the textile department, which is somewhat obvious, and this is actually the kind of comparison with the Bauhaus, where again we know of Günther Stoffel, and who was the first woman to be granted a kind of, and even then it was not, I think, formally confirmed, the master's status. But she was the one on the roof in the 1926 photo, the only woman on the roof among the Bauhaus faculty. At the Vkhutemas, we have a number of women in the textile department who are in the kind of really prominent leadership positions, both, interestingly enough, in the school and also in the industry, because the department is really connected to the actual, factories in Moscow in this case. So it certainly is much more, I would say equal in that sense. But of course, there's still a long journey ahead.
Mm-hmm. I want to just switch or shift the topic just for a minute to bring in some of your other work as well. So I know you've written also about the Soviet Workers' Club and this term social condenser. And then in rereading parts of your book today, and you also use this term educational condenser to talk about the school. And so I'm, again, trying to find these terms that are useful for kind of cross-cultural understanding, right? So when we talk about the Bauhaus versus Vkhutemas, you're talking about like a kind of pedagogical change versus a societal change, right? And so how you have to really understand all the changes that were happening in society at large in the Russian context to really understand why the school operated the way it did. And I'm wondering if this term condenser then could help us think about, like, is that a useful term to use today? Does it only apply to this specific kind of time period? Or is that a term that you find could be also applicable to, I don't know, education today, or more as a teaching tool and less as a thing that we could observe in the world?
It's interesting because I think it's a fantastic term. And what's interesting about it is that it actually been resonating with us, I think, more recently. Let's say more so than in the last decade, since the term was in fact introduced by the leaders of OSA, the Society of Contemporary Architects, Ginsburg and others. And what they suggested is that architecture was, the new architecture had to become something that would condense and conduct the new socialist culture. That sort of was the idea, that it wasn't just something from this earlier retrograde bourgeois days, but it would have this incredible agency that even though the society may not be yet ready for the change, through the sheer kind of power and energy, I would say an agency of space itself, the built form, the society could be kind of indoctrinated in this new way. And that's, of course, an incredibly important idea, a very ambitious one, but the one that I think resonates again with us today in a way that transcends the sort of political or ideological, I would say, message that it originally comes with. So the school, in this particular sense, is a place where it's not just about education, but it's about culture, right? Where the students are able to kind of, exchange this culture, but also generate it. And in particular, and this is, I think, what also unites Vkhutemas and the Bauhaus, is that both schools were places where students were not just, studying something, but they were really living there. They were, communicating. They were spending every, waking hour. They were, there was entertainment. There was all sorts of, events, collective, et cetera, things that they did together. So in Vkhutemas, they also lived together in the kind of dormitories, so in this communal setting. And there's so much that goes on in this, time that's just outside of the actual educational process that is so important. So, and again, after our year and a half of being kind of isolated, I think we cannot, we cannot, underestimate the importance of this kind of level of socialization, where it's not just about the formal, but also about the informal. So that's something what happens. But yes, this idea of the condenser is about, I would say, the agency of architecture and the potential of it.
Great. Yeah, well, we have a few more minutes, so I would encourage anybody who hasn't submitted a question on YouTube to go ahead and do that. But maybe in the meantime, Anna, you could tell us a little bit about the archival process that goes into research like this. I mean, the book is thick. The book is filled with, amazing images. I really encourage our audience to pick up a copy. It's gorgeous, but also, very well documented and really dense with ideas and research. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about, because at the end of their presentation, you were even suggesting that again in the 30s, as they were kind of transitioning to a different school, that of course maybe Vkhutemas was pushed aside or de-emphasized, not encouraged as a form of architectural pedagogy. When did that come back, and when was the kind of value in that seen again, maybe from an archival process, or is it now still very difficult to find the materials because of that shift?
Great question, Ashley. Thank you. So it's actually was a bit of a how to say it, like a kind of discovering maybe a fountain of sorts. When you I don't know if this is a good analogy, but when you look for oil and then all of a sudden you find there is this sort of fountain of oil. What's that in the famous movie, right? Anyway, so it felt like there is this kind of landslide of material. Actually, once you open up that, it's like a Pandora's box. Once you open it up, then it's just never ending, in fact. And so this is why I'd say that this is the topic that is going to, continue on in terms of, new research, new publications, new work, I hope, because the only thing that, in fact, maybe stands in between Vkhutemas sort of occupying a place of, let's say not equality, but somewhat balanced position relative to the Bauhaus is, I would say, the language barriers, because majority of the documentation is in Russian, and so just it's prohibitive in terms of understanding what exactly was meant. But there's a cultural challenges, because it is a moment in history that has also very particular kind of ideological weight that sometimes is distracting, let's say, right? And so for me, as somebody who is interested in this first and foremost from a kind of architectural standpoint, it was incredibly exciting to see that almost in every single, once you start looking, that almost in every single publication, periodical of that period, in particular, maybe kind of later, mid to later 20s, there is something about Vkhutemas in every single journal. I mean, literally, you can open up any one and you'd see something. And in all the different fields also, because it's 8 different faculties. So there's textiles, there's ceramics, there is sculpture, there is painting. And so there's essentially an entire generation for whom that was the kind of central place, that's again like the Bauhaus, right, where everything, no matter where you look, you're going to find something. So that was a revelation. I personally did not even realize to what degree, and still continue to be surprised with the kind of lens that I have looking for everything, all things Vkhutemas, that it was just everywhere at the time. So it's not so you don't have to even look for it. It just kind of, you just have to open anything. And I showed just a few things that were, you'd think like, why would they show student work? But they did, because it was on that level, and because it was that important, because they were really doing things that were truly ahead of their time. So, and in every single, like as I said, in every single department and every single faculty, those were. It was a huge institution, so there was a huge kind of plurality, let's put it this way, amongst the different professors and students. So it was by no means a unified school, and I think that's what makes it also very complex to study and look at, because you have very traditionalist faculty and you have very progressive faculty, and often there is a huge sort of disagreement. There is a kind of competition, but I think through that sort of diversity, actually, there is a way that they achieve the kind of heights and the kinds of new ideas that would have been impossible had they all agreed on one thing. So, I think this is really important to mention that there was not a pyramid by any means. It was actually a lot of voices that were sort of yelling at the same time.
Like any good faculty, right? Well, thank you so much. I want to also just kind of follow up on what you were just talking about it not being as well known. And I think that's one reason why I'm so excited that your book exists in the world now, because I as many instructors do, teaching today, we're always trying to incorporate more, again, non-Western focused architectural history. And that's what I've been trying to do in several courses that I teach. And one thing that we're often confronted with is maybe the lack of publication in English, for example, right? So that our students can fully understand that. And so, I think more publications about this, region of the world and this, history and time and place are just so valuable. And it gives us as teachers, just more resources, more things to draw from and to make our classes and our current education so much better. And so I will just say thank you to you for that. And thank you for joining us tonight. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And yes, really, really happy to hear that. Thank you.
And thank you for everyone joining us on YouTube.
Excellent. Great.
Our next lecture will be with Sharon Zukin, and that is on September 29th.